It's been a half century since these images haunted American living rooms. Vietnam was coming to a close. Troops came home to little fanfare and all too often hostility. But to Vietnamese orphans like Tran Van Kirk, the exit of U.S. forces opened the door to a new beginning in this week's History Through the Lens. Hello, I'm Tom Shad. Welcome to History Through the Lens. 1975, that's the year we're going back to. Actually, we're going back to 6 years before that, 1969, outside Da Nang in Vietnam. A little baby was born, and we're going to get a very interesting story, a different perspective of American involvement in that war 50 years later. I'm joined now by Tran Van Kirk, who lives now in Norfolk in Ocean View. Born in Vietnam, later adopted and brought over to the United States. He's produced many documentaries. He has worked with other Amerasians, if you will, people who are descendants of American service personnel in Vietnam, and joins us here today with a special perspective in this week's edition of History Through the Lens. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here.
Let's go back to Da Nang, 1969. You were born and sent to an orphanage. Can you just give us a background on just who you are?
Sure. Well, as you said, I was born in the summer of 1969. My father was a service member that was serving in Vietnam, and my mother was a Vietnamese woman that was living in there. They met over there, had a relationship, fell in love, and as a result, I was born. And shortly after I was born, I was forcibly taken from my mother and put into an orphanage because of the stigma attached with me being half American, half Vietnamese. So I was put into an orphanage, and then when I was about 2.5 years old, I was adopted by an American Army officer that was serving in Vietnam as well, and was raised by my adopted family throughout the rest of my childhood.
So you really have a perspective from both the American side and the Vietnamese side in terms of the war, the legacy, what this has done to Vietnamese culture and American culture. And I'm sure that in your journeys, you've produced a major documentary called Intersections. It's won many awards. And tell us exactly how you came about to do that project.
Well, I wanted to do that project because I wanted to give a perspective or a side of the war, the Vietnam War, that most people have never heard. Many people have seen Platoon, Born on the 4th of July, Full Metal Jacket, and that's kind of their stereotypical view of what the Vietnam War is. But what a lot of people don't know and have never heard about are the Amerasians like me, 100,000 plus that were born over there as a result of that war, and what has happened to them from the time they were born to today. So that documentary kind of opens the eyes of people to that perspective of the war that no one's ever heard before.
Amerasian, so American, Asian, Amerasian. So they were looked down upon too, especially in Vietnamese culture.
Correct. Especially during the time of war, because Americans were viewed as the occupiers. So obviously, if you have a child that's born, number one, out of wedlock, and number two is somewhat the face of the enemy, is what they viewed Amerasians as. So, people talk about racism and not being accepted in this country. In that country at the time during the Vietnam War, I can only imagine what that must have been like to be exposed as a Vietnamese woman to the treatment she might have received for having a child that was not full Vietnamamese.
I think you called it geopolitical racism, in a sense.
Yeah, I don't know if that's an official term, but that's kind of the term that I referred to, because that was I call it geopolitical racism because there was a lot of adversity that I faced growing up, even as an adult in my professional career, where I would work with people that served during the Vietnam War, and I was treated quite differently, strictly because of my roots in Vietnam.
Yeah, they looked at you. You told me about one man you worked with who was a Vietnam veteran who looked at you and said, "You remind me of those dark times," basically. And he took that out on you, didn't he?
He did. He was a police sergeant. I was this is when I was working for the police department. But in the end, we ended up being friends. But when I first met him, he was very hostile towards me. Called me, derogatory terms that nowadays would have gotten you fired in a heartbeat.
Wow.
Called me Charlie and all sorts of other things. But once he got to know me and he understood that I wasn't the enemy, things were fine. But it was just an example of being treated differently or negatively, not because of race, but because of your origins and the geopolitical atmosphere in America surrounding that entire world.
Very, very divisive time in this country,
Right.
as you know. Do you have any memories at all of that orphanage? Or you were adopted, I think, when you were a toddler.
Right. When I was about 2.5, I don't have any memories per se as far as experiences, but I can, especially when I went back to the orphanage in 2019 for the first time in over 48
It's still there,
years.
right?
It's still there. Yeah, it's still there. Now it's
Sacred Heart.
It's a school for disabled children now. It's not an orphanage, but it's a school for disabled children over there. But I remember how I felt over there. I remember some of the architecture was kind of crazy, going back and seeing it and remembering and just having these almost like flashbacks of, I remember that. I remember that window. I remember this door.
You were 2.5 when you left. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's really incredible. And then in your search, I think this whole idea of doing a documentary was after you got a phone call back in 2017. Talk about that.
Well, when I was adopted, or I was not adopted, but when I was old enough to understand that I was adopted, I can remember asking my adoptive father, what happened to at the time I said my real parents, because I didn't know any better. I was only probably about 7 or 8 years old.
Okay. So late 1970s.
Right. And I remember him telling me that, well, the assumption is both your parents were killed, and that's why you were in the orphanage. So for 47, 48 years of my life, I've gone through life thinking that both my biological parents were killed in the war. Well, in 2017, I decided I want to take a DNA test. And the purpose was just to find out what my other half was. I knew half of me was Vietnamese, but I had no idea what the other half was. I thought I was half Hawaiian because I get very dark in the summertime. I love surfing, I love fishing. So that's kind of the lifestyle that I adopted. So I took a DNA test just to find out what my other half was. Well, 30 days later, I get a phone call out of the blue from this woman who claims that she's my birth mother.
Oh, wow.
And it turns out through DNA testing, we found out that she was in fact my birth mother, and she'd been looking for me her entire life, or my entire life. And she had submitted for a DNA test 2 years before I did, in hopes of trying to connect with me.
Wow, we're going to stop right there. Yeah. That's a great place to stop because I want to hear more about this.
Sure.
We'll take a quick break and come back with Tran Van Kirk on this edition of History Through the Lens. Welcome back to History Through the Lens. I'm Tom Shad. Vietnam 50 years later. We're doing a different perspective, though, from kind of the other side, meaning the Vietnamese side, not necessarily the Viet Cong or the communist side, but just the two cultures and how different they are. I'm here with Tran Van Kirk, who lives in Ocean View now in Norfolk, and he was adopted from an orphanage in Vietnam and brought here to America. So you kind of tasted both worlds, especially since you've been going back and retracing roots of other Amerasians too. Let's pick up where this woman contacted you and wanted to find you. Said it was your mother?
Yeah, it was my birth mother.
Your birth mother. And then what happened after that?
It was a whirlwind. I mean, that's the best way to describe it, is whirlwind, because in that single phone conversation, I found out not only was she alive, I found out that during her search for me, she found my birth father, and that he was still alive and living up in Syracuse, New York.
Did you believe this when you got this call?
No,
were you the least bit skeptical? I didn't think you were.
I was skeptical, because before I got the call, I actually got an email from her first.
Okay.
It was just, I'm looking for my son, please call me. And I thought this was some kind of scam. I was like,
Sure.
someone's going to call and say, well, we need some money for this, that, or the other. So I thought it was a scam.
Right.
And it wasn't until I was able to listen to her side of the story and what happened with me after I was born and her search that a lot of the details started matching up. I was like, this is probably real. But it was hard to believe, because if it weren't for the DNA test, I probably still wouldn't believe it today. But, when I looked into the DNA testing and realized they're about 99.9% accurate on a hit that strong,
Sure.
There's no denying it.
And this was 2017, so you're already an adult. You've already built a life here in America. So if you were younger, say if you were a teenager, could this have had a different effect on you? I mean,
It,
knowing.
it might have, but I can tell you right now that growing up, my adoptive family provided me the best life I could have ever had. I had every opportunity a child could have growing up. Wonderful, loving family. I have absolutely no complaints whatsoever about the childhood I was given. If I found my birth family when I was a teenager, it might have been a different story because at that age, teenagers know more than we do now, and I might have been a little more rebellious and more
Right.
insistent on expanding my horizons when it came to family life. So I think in that aspect it might have been different, but I think everything happens for a reason and the timing it happens. I think there was a reason that I didn't find him until now because I was given the opportunity to have a very, very good childhood.
And then you got together with your birth mother. Describe that reunion.
It was surreal. Every time everyone asked me about it, I tell them I think back on the day and it was like I was on the outside looking at this story unfold. It was unreal. It was interesting to learn that she had been in the United States and had lived in the United States longer than I had. She came back a year before I did. She had married a different service member and came back to the United States, immigrated to the United States a year before I was adopted.
Wow.
So found out she was living in Texas, actually less than an hour away from where my adoptive parents had settled. They'd been within that proximity for over 20 some years, but she lives in Texas. And then, like I said, found out my birth father was still alive and living up in Syracuse.
Now let's go back to the Amerasian experience in Vietnam. And when you're a 2.5-year-old kid, you were telling me earlier that there really is not much opportunity for anybody who is considered, connected to the American experience of the Vietnam War as you were. Can you tell me what kinds of obstacles somebody would face in Vietnam, why you had to get out of there?
Sure. Well, one of the opportunities I had when I was doing the production of the Intersections documentary was in 2021. I got to go back to Vietnam and I got to actually meet 7 Amerasians that were still in Vietnam, that were stuck there, that were never able to get out. They didn't speak English, so we had to have a translator. But through the translations and the conversations we had, I found out that they were looked down upon kind of like a caste system. They were looked at as the bottom of the barrel. They weren't allowed to get educated. They weren't allowed to have well-paying jobs. They were the laborers, the hard workers. Many of them talked about how their job growing up from the time they could hold their hand out till almost an adult was to go out and beg for their family because they weren't allowed to do anything else.
My.
Many of them through their teen years and preteen years were subjected to re-education camps by the communists to ensure that they understood the ideology.
After Saigon fell, we had the communist government now in Vietnam.
So they wanted to make sure that these Amerasians understood the ideology of their government and what was expected of them.
And it was basically a second-class citizen. And when you say caste system, there's no hope to rise above your place in that culture.
Not within that culture. The only hope was to be able to get out, whether it was through the Amerasian Homecoming Act back in the early 2000s, or in many cases, some of them escaped, through neighboring countries to be able to get over the United States, or even some ended up in Australia, some ended up in Europe. It just depends on what route they could get out.
Now, in your travels doing documentaries, you were able to reconnect with a lot of Vietnam veterans. Can you tell me any people that stand out that have actually? There was a guy who took the picture of you, right? I'm thinking that right off the top of my head.
Yeah, Richard Bursicki. He was a Marine medic.
That's right.
Serving in Vietnam, and reconnected with him through the wonderful technology of the internet and just doing research for the documentary. And turns out he was one of the many veterans that would volunteer his time on the weekends to come to my orphanage and play with the kids, administer medication, deliver food to them, set up generators just to make sure that we were okay. But 50 years later, here's the man. Of course, I don't remember him.
No, of course not.
But he's actually got a picture of me, in the orphanage, and I've never seen the picture before. It was crazy. But to be able to reconnect with somebody that had that much of a connection with you 50 years ago and how it affects them nowadays, that was nothing short of miraculous.
Yeah, when we saw the open, there was a veteran holding you in that, but that was the man who adopted you, right?
Yep.
Okay, so that was your original adoptive father.
Correct.
Living in Texas.
Yes.
Okay, right. But Richard, I believe, was 19 years old when he was volunteering at that orphanage along with other service members. I mean, it seems like there was a movement at that time to try to do something for the people who lived there. We heard about the negatives
Mm-hmm.
on how American troops sometimes, treated, the people who lived in Vietnam. And then we had that other side.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, Richard often, when I first got to talk to him, he'd often talk about how, because I asked him why the orphanage. You see all these movies where all these GIs are doing other things they
all
probably
these
should be
horrible
doing.
things, right? No, really,
And he
we
said
have a legacy of that,
yeah,
unfortunately.
and he would say it was a reminder of the good side of what was happening.
Right.
And the very unique thing I found out about reconnecting with these veterans like Richard Bursicki, and then there's Eddie, who you met.
I
up in
did,
New
right,
York.
from upstate New York, yeah.
The interesting thing was when I first started reconnecting with them, my original intent was to be able to give them a sense of gratitude and thank you for their service, because they didn't get that wonderful homecoming that they deserved.
No,
So
they didn't. That's right.
My intention was to give them the gratitude and the honor they deserve. But what I found out was they were in turn thanking me and other Amerasians for connecting with them, because it put to rest what they've been struggling with for 50 years of not knowing what happened to children like us. They devoted all that time and energy in trying to help us have a better life in the short time they could while they were over there, and then leave the country not knowing if we were dead or alive, if we made it out. Wow. And being able to reconnect with us 50 years later, I found was very healing.
Okay, we're going to take a break and come back with more History Through the Lens with Tran Van Kirk and Vietnam 50 years later after this. Back with Tran Van Kirk in this edition of History Through the Lens. We're looking at Vietnam 50 years later, 1975, the end of the war. Also meant a new beginning for many people, including Tran here, who now lives in Norfolk in Ocean View with the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. Mm-hmm. And you've also made a documentary film that's won many awards about the Amerasian experience and reconnecting Amerasian people with Vietnam veterans. And what has that experience done to you? Has it given you things that you really didn't want to know about? Or is it broadened your horizons or made you much more understanding of all sides of this issue?
The easy answer to that is yes. It definitely opened my eyes to a different perspective, being able to meet other Amerasians with similar backgrounds, because as an adoptee, and I don't speak for all adoptees, but as an adoptee, especially from the Vietnam War era, I know growing up that I struggled a lot with the feeling of belonging. I never felt like I belonged with any group. Even as loving as my family was, there was always in the back of my mind, I wonder, growing up from the time you knew you were adopted, in adulthood, always wondering, where's my mom and where's my dad? Do I have other family somewhere? So being able to reconnect with other Amerasians that have lived that same life has been very cathartic and healing for everybody that's involved in that. It's also opened some wounds, because there's,
Sure.
One of the things I found out with my story is it's the exception, not the norm. There's many Amerasian children that have grown up looking for their family and have to date not found it and living with that heartbreak. And I've, met some that have reconnected with their birth father, and their birth father didn't want to have anything to do with them, because it goes back to that reminder of what the war is about. It's not a matter of blood ties for that birth father. It's a matter of your reminder of the trauma and the carnage and the violence I saw over there. I don't want anything to do with you. I've got a family. I've got a wife. I don't need another son that I didn't know I had.
Have you been able to break through any of those particular log jams in situations like that, where you would encounter, say, you had an Amerasian person looking for their birth mother and father, and the father said, "Donald," were you able to break through any of those? Any specific examples you can give me where it was a success?
My story, actually, because when I first talked to my birth father, the first thing,
I didn't know this.
Yeah,
this is new.
The first thing, the first conversation I had with him, he was very skeptical. The first question he asked me was, "What do you want from me? What do you need?" I'm like, "I don't want or need anything. I just want to know who you are and want to, have a relationship with you." So it was kind of awkward, because, Amerasians, growing up, and I've heard this from several of them, their idea or their fantasy is they're going to call and, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know I had a son. Come, let me give you a hug," and all that. And it's been quite the opposite.
Come to our wealthy home in America.
Exactly. But unfortunately, because of the stigma attached to the war and all the negative, aspects of it, I think Amerasians are faced with that whole stereotype of negativity and that stigma of, well, they must want something, or they need something, or they wouldn't be trying to contact us.
Yeah, I didn't ask this though, but what was it like growing up here when you were a child and the Vietnam War gone already had been a memory, and you'll say 9, 10 years old and people are still talking about it. And, how was that for you growing up in America?
I mean, it was difficult, but thankfully I was shielded a lot by my adoptive family, by their love and their understanding of what they were trying to do. But there was times I can remember coming home and I thought, they would call me Charlie. And I'm talking about elementary school. They would call me Charlie,
Oh my.
and I would think it was cool because I thought they were referring to Charlie from
Oh.
Charlie's Angels, but they were like, no, they're not referring to that. And then I can remember times of playing war, and I was always picked to be the bad guy. And I couldn't quite understand that growing up. But so, like I said, it was the stigma of the whole geopolitical environment surrounding the war. What had very little to do with race. I'd never ever grown up feeling like I was treated differently because of my race. It was always because of where I came from, and people found out, what my background was. Even, like I said, even in my adult life, I encountered some of that.
You were able to overcome that though. I mean, but it kind of opened up new wounds when you started doing these documentaries, right?
Oh yeah. Anytime you dig back into an unknown past and you don't know what you're going to find, especially if you're working with other people with similar backgrounds that didn't have the blessing of the upbringing I had, doesn't have the blessing of finding both, birth parents that were accepting of me. Because like I said, most of them have not found a mother or father yet. And they were actually looking. I wasn't even looking. That's the crazy
got
thing
this phone call.
Yeah.
Email and a phone call
out of nowhere. I wasn't even looking, but I've met adoptees that have been looking there.
I mean, we warn people about that on our newscasts every day. When you get this email, delete.
Exactly. Like I said, I thought it was a scam when I first got the email. But yeah, it's good and it's bad. Like I said, my story is definitely the exception, not the norm. And I work with a group we call the Amerasian Coalition, and we're a nonprofit that tries to help reconnect Amerasians with their birth families, and also works to help veterans with healing their wounds and being able to connect with them. Kind of what I was talking earlier, being able to go to some of their reunions and meetings and meeting with them and giving them a sense of peace.
It seems that's like the first step before you can make these difficult connections again is making sure that you're okay, making sure that you're dealing with the demons that you have brought to the table from this conflict.
And a lot of the demons you have, you don't even realize you have until you start pulling those scabs back. That's one of the things I found with working with the other adoptees, that on the surface, you would think, when you first meet them, they're fine, everything's good. But then when you start pulling back the layers and you start pulling back decades of the pain that they are dealing with, not having an identity, not knowing where they came from, not knowing if they have any birth family, it leads to a lot of dark roads for some of them. So that's one of the things we do, is try to reconnect with some of these Amerasian adoptees so they understand that they're not alone, what they're feeling is normal, and that there is light at the end of the tunnel.
So the documentary you did, Intersections, this can be viewed online. Can you stream it online?
Well, we got a link. We got a Vimeo channel, and I can provide you the links.
Okay.
Watch that. Yeah.
Vimeo, right? Okay. Just want to make sure that people know about that, because that just sounds like a really, really wonderful. And I want to look at it too, because I've seen trailers and bits and pieces, and I never knew where to find it, because you have to go to a specific place. So we'll try to help people with that as well. Well, time is just about up. Any more you want to add about this experience for you and what it's meant to the 50th anniversary of Vietnam? What do you think, looking back and saying it's been 50 years since this war, and it seems like yesterday in many ways?
I think looking back, the biggest thing I take away from it is that if people can openly communicate and talk about their differences, where they belong, that feeling of belonging, whether it's family or whether it's a group of people, that they shouldn't let what happened, politically speaking, as far as what happened with that war, define what their life's going to be like.
You said something there that maybe we can apply that to our politics today domestically, because, if we try to listen to each other and try to understand where you're coming from, we might be able to reach some kind of consensus.
Oh yeah, that's the biggest part of misunderstanding. Biggest part of a misunderstanding is not listening. And I think if people can listen, they can hear different perspectives, and they can understand what it's like to walk in the shoes of somebody who had nothing to do with the war other than the fact they were born from there. If they can open their mind and understand other people's experiences, that's going to open doors for healing for everyone. Very
enlightening conversation. Tran Van Kirk from Norfolk in Ocean View. in this edition of History Through the Lens. Thank you for joining us today
for
and
having
talking
me.
about Vietnam from a different perspective. Somebody who has come from a war-torn country to America and trying to bring two sides together for a better understanding of what happened in perhaps the most divisive American war ever. I'm Tom Shad. Thank you for joining us. And remember, we make history every day.